All right, welcome to the Week 3 Forum. This week we are surveying research on the causes of political terrorism. Like last week, I don't necessarily want you to go into this chapter thinking that there's any one approach to explaining the causes of terrorism, and that one approach will explain all terrorism. There are no silver bullet theories that capture all the factors that may contribute to people resorting to violence. Um, One thing that I found particularly interesting is the changing nature of gender in understanding the causes of terrorism. Even in the 1980s, when I first started studying terrorism, there were women terrorists. For example, Ulrich Meinhof was a founding member of the Red Army faction in Germany. The conventional wisdom, however, has been that most terrorists were men, and that that's important to keep in mind when you look at chapter perspective 3.1 on page 53. It notes that women have often played a high-profile role in revolutionary organizations. So the question really is, how common is terrorism by women? What motivates women to become terrorists? What kinds of environments are most likely to produce female terrorists? And of course, I think in the text they mention the rise of the Black Widows among Chechens, and largely that's again because the Russians were profiling for men, and that made it, basically created a target of opportunity for Chechen women to get more involved and to exploit those weaknesses. Um, Political explanations for the cause of terrorism tend to focus on unequal distributions of power, authority, and economic opportunity as crucial for understanding terrorism. Uh, does injustice create an environment in which terrorism is more likely? And of course, the answer to some extent is it may often be sort of a necessary but not sufficient condition. There's a lot of injustice in the world, and it doesn't always produce terrorism. What role does culture play in motivating people to violence? For example, many Americans just seem to assume that the cultures of Islamic societies are simply more prone to violence than our Western European societies. But is that a fair assumption to make? For example, American culture tolerates shockingly high rates of interpersonal violence. I mean, that literally shock other people that come from other cultures. At least one American subculture places an enormously high value on personal honor and hypermasculinity, traits highly correlated with violence. Perhaps as Americans, we should be a little more careful about what we, assume. Uh, a couple of important unifying themes tie together many of the sociological and criminological theories of what causes terrorism. One is that virtually everyone who commits terrorist acts are extremists, but they don't just become extremists. You don't wake up one morning and suddenly decide you're an extremist. You go through some kind of radicalization process. Um, what do these radicalization processes look like? I mentioned last week that almost invariably terrorism as a term is deployed in a critical manner. That is, people calling an action terrorism are implicitly saying this action is a bad thing and not, cannot be justified by any moral or ethical standard. How do terrorists themselves portray their actions? Um, in the late 19th century, many leftists and anarchists explained their actions by rejecting conventional morality, arguing along Marxist lines that religious and ethical prohibitions on violence were part of an ideological superstructure imposed on us by the bourgeoisie to cow us into submission. And that as revolutionaries, their job was to reject such conventions. They actually used the term terrorism in a positive sense, arguing that that violence was necessary to break down an unjust system of exploitation and oppression. How does that kind of rationale strike you, for violence? The arguments about, that morality is for suckers highlights something in the latter portions of the chapter, where Martin is highlighting the role that codes of self-sacrifice play in terrorist justification for their actions. Martin cites Sergei Nechayev, whose Catechism of a Revolutionary talks about the commitments of the revolutionary man How did Nechayev characterize the kinds of commitments that revolutionaries need to adopt in order to be successful? One last item related to this week's reading relates to the idea that terrorists adopt these codes of self-sacrifice. He notes the militaristic codes that fascists in Germany and Japan adopted as vehicles of radicalization. Um, how would you go about comparing and contrasting the Waffen SS and the code of Bushido that the Nazis and the Imperial Japanese army, adopted as a way of trying to, basically radicalize their, aspects of their military? These are, to me, really interesting questions. And there's a lot more to talk about in this chapter, and I hope we have a lively and entertaining discussion this week. Remember, if there's anything in this chapter that you don't understand, please ask a question, and I'll try to clear it up for you. Let's have a great week.